Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The Boeing 777 dropped 3,000 feet in a heartbeat, turning the screams of 300 passengers into a singular, deafening wail of terror. Oxygen masks rained down like plastic stalactites, swinging violently as the cabin tilted into a sickening 45-degree dive. In the plush seclusion of first class, Cashin Vane, the ruthless CEO of Vane Heavy Industries, felt the blood drain from his face. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests of his leather seat, the world outside the window a blurring nightmare of gray storm clouds and jagged lightning. But amidst the chaos, the sensory overload, and the terrifying realization that he might die in a flying tin can, one sound cut through the noise. It wasn't a scream. It was the sharp, commanding click of a seatbelt unbuckling next to him. Cashin whipped his head around, eyes wide. The Omega he had spent the last 2 hours mercilessly mocking, the disheveled, impoverished-looking creature clutching a sleeping toddler, was standing up. Gravity fought them, pinning mortals to their seats, but Julian Harth moved with the unnatural grace of a man who had lived his life defying physics. The soft, tired look in his amber eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial focus that was more terrifying than the storm. "Hold him," Julian ordered. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a vibration of absolute authority that bypassed Cashin's brain and went straight to his primal instincts. Before Cashin could protest, before he could sneer as he had done 10 minutes ago about breeders and baggage, the Omega shoved the waking, whimpering toddler into Cashin's arms. "If anything happens to my son," Julian hissed, leaning in close, his scent of rain and ozone spiking with a lethal edge, "I will drag you to hell myself." Then, the Omega turned and sprinted, up the inclined aisle toward the cockpit, moving against the G-force like a god of war ascending a mountain. 2 hours earlier, the atmosphere in the cabin had been very different. Cashin Vane did not fly commercial. He was a man who owned the sky, or at least, the companies that built the machines that traversed it. But when the Gilded Hawk, his private Gulfstream, suffered a critical turbine failure in Singapore, and the emergency board meeting in Tokyo could not be postponed, he had been forced to mingle with the commoners. He had bought out the entire front row of first class, expecting solitude. He hadn't accounted for the airline's family priority policy, which placed a single Omega and his child in the seat across the aisle. From the moment Julian had boarded, Cashin had been staring, not out of admiration, but out of disdain. Julian was wearing a frayed, oversized knitted sweater that had seen better days. His dark hair was tied back in a messy bun, and he had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He looked soft. He looked weak. He looked like everything Cashin despised, a domestic creature burdened by biology, seemingly without ambition. When the child, a 2-year-old boy named Leo, had let out a small, fussy cry, Cashin had snapped. "Can you keep that thing quiet?" Cashin had drawled, not bothering to look up from his tablet. "Some of us are trying to work. I paid $10,000 for this seat, not for a front-row ticket to a nursery." Julian had flinched, pulling the child closer. "I'm sorry, sir. The air pressure hurts his ears. I'm doing my best." "Your best is inadequate," Cashin had sneered, taking a sip of his champagne. "Typical Omega. Thinking the world stops because you decided to reproduce. If you can't control your baggage, perhaps you should have taken the bus." It was a low blow. Cruel. Unnecessary. Cashin knew it, but he was stressed, and lashing out was his preferred method of stress relief. He expected the Omega to cry, or to cower. Instead, Julian had looked at him. Really looked at him. For a second, the exhaustion in the Omega's face cleared, revealing a sharp, angular jawline and eyes that held a tempest of suppressed rage. "And you," Julian had replied, his voice soft but steady, "are wearing a bespoke Italian suit, yet you lack the basic manners of a street dog. Money can buy the seat, alpha, but it can't buy class." Cashin had been so stunned by the retort that he had sat in silence, fuming, plotting how he would ruin this man's life once they landed. But now, the plane was screaming. "Is there a pilot on board?" The flight attendant's voice cracked over the intercom, shrill and hysterical. The captain has collapsed. Please. Anyone. The chaotic lurch of the aircraft suggested the co-pilot was either incapacitated or incompetent. The nose dipped again. The toddler in Cashin's arms began to wail, a high-pitched siren of fear. Cashin looked down at the child. He had never held a baby in his life. He felt the small, warm weight against his silk suit, the tiny fingers gripping his lapel. It's okay, Cashin muttered, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He looked toward the cockpit door where Julian had vanished. Your dad is crazy. Inside the cockpit, chaos reigned. The air was thick with the metallic smell of burnt wiring and the acrid stench of vomit. The captain was slumped over the center console, foaming at the mouth, a severe allergic reaction or a seizure. The co-pilot was conscious but paralyzed by panic, frantically pulling back on the yoke, stalling the aircraft rather than correcting the glide. Let go, Julian roared, entering the small space. The co-pilot turned, eyes wide and weeping. We're going to die? The hydraulics are sluggish, I can't. Julian didn't argue. He didn't have time for diplomacy. He moved with the brutal efficiency of his past life. He grabbed the co-pilot by the collar and yanked him out of the seat, tossing him toward the jump seat with a strength that belied his slender frame. Sit down, strap in, and shut up, Julian commanded. He slid into the pilot's seat. His hands, which had been shaking earlier while mixing formula, were now rock steady. He grabbed the yoke. It felt like coming home. It felt like breathing. Asterisk horizon line. Airspeed. Altitude. Asterisk. The data flooded his brain, overriding the fear. He was no longer Julian Harth, the struggling single father working 2 jobs at a bakery. He was call sign Viper, the youngest squadron leader in the history of the Pacific Air Defense, the man who had been court-martialed for an unauthorized maneuver that saved 50 civilians. He was the sky god who had clipped his own wings to raise a child in peace. Tower, this is Flight 808. Julian's voice was ice-cold over the radio, cutting through the static. Mayday, mayday. Captain incapacitated. We are in a severe descent. Requesting immediate vector for emergency landing. Over. Flight 808, identify. The controller's voice came back, shaky. Are you a passenger? I am the pilot now, Julian snapped. He disengaged the autopilot, which was fighting the storm, and took manual control. The plane groaned. The metal screamed under the stress. They were hitting a pocket of typhoon-grade turbulence. The nose was too heavy. Come on, you beautiful beast, Julian whispered, his teeth gritted. He felt the plane like an extension of his own nervous system. He pulled back, fighting the wind shear. In the cabin, the passengers felt the shift. The sickening drop stopped. The plane leveled out, banking hard to the left with a precision that was aggressive but controlled. Cashin Vane felt the change in his gut. The G-force pressed him into the seat. He looked out the window and saw the ocean churning violently below, dangerously close, but they were no longer falling. They were flying. For 45 minutes, the cabin was a tomb of silence, broken only by the roar of the engines fighting the gale. Cashin held the boy, Leo, who had surprisingly fallen asleep against his chest, soothed by the Alpha's deep, rhythmic heartbeat. Cashin stared at the cockpit door. Who was that Omega? The way he had moved, the command in his voice. It was inconsistent with the fraying sweater and the poverty. It was inconsistent with the biology Cashin had spent his life dismissing. Then came the landing. It wasn't gentle. It was a controlled crash. The runway at Narita Airport was slick with rain, the crosswinds howling at 50 knots. The plane slammed onto the tarmac, bounced once, and then the reverse thrusters roared like dragons. Julian fought the yoke, his muscles burning, sweat dripping down his temple. He pumped the rudder pedals, dancing the fine line between traction and hydroplaning. The plane shuddered, groaned, and finally, miraculously, slowed to a halt. For a second, there was silence. Then, the cabin erupted in sobbing cheers. Julian slumped back in the seat, his chest heaving. His hands shook now. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing reality of what he had just done. He had exposed himself. He had flown again. He unbuckled his harness and stood up on trembling legs. He needed to get Leo. He needed to get out before the press swarmed. He stumbled out of the cockpit. The passengers in first class stared at him in awe. But Julian only had eyes for seat 1A. Cashin Vane was standing there, his suit rumpled, holding Leo as if the child were a rare porcelain vase. Their eyes locked. Cashin didn't sneer. He didn't mock. He looked at Julian with an expression that sat somewhere between shock and a newfound, terrifying hunger. You, Cashin breathed. Julian snatched his son from the alpha's arms, hugging the boy tightly, burying his face in the toddler's neck to hide his own tears. Thank you for holding him, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. Excuse me. He tried to push past, but Cashin's hand shot out, gripping Julian's wrist. It wasn't aggressive, it was desperate. Who are you? Cashin demanded. That wasn't amateur flying. You just landed a 777 in a typhoon. I'm nobody, Julian said, pulling his arm free. Just a single dad who couldn't afford a private jet. He turned and fled toward the emergency slide the crew had just deployed, disappearing into the rain. The meteor storm was almost as violent as the typhoon. The ghost pilot, the miracle of Flight 808. Cashin Vane watched the news from the penthouse suite of the Tokyo Amon Hotel. He ignored the calls from his board of directors. He ignored the stock market reports. On the massive television screen, a grainy video taken by a passenger showed Julian's blurry figure exiting the cockpit. Find him, Cashin said into his phone. Sir, his head of security, Marcus, replied on the other end. The passenger manifest lists him as Julian Harth. Former employment listed as a baker. Dig deeper, Cashin growled, pacing the room. He could still smell the rain and ozone scent of the Omega. It haunted him. He looked at his suit jacket, draped over a chair. It still smelled like baby powder and the Omega's fear. A baker doesn't know how to vector a heavy aircraft against a 50-knot crosswind. A baker doesn't have eyes that look like they've seen the curvature of the earth from a fighter cockpit. I'll put the team on it. Marcus, Cashin added, his voice dropping an octave. I want him found tonight. And when you find him, do not approach him. Tell me where he is. It took 3 hours. Julian was staying in a cheap capsule hotel near the airport, likely waiting for the cheapest flight back home once the investigation cleared him. Cashin didn't take a car. He took a helicopter. He found Julian in the small common area of the capsule hotel, feeding Leo a cup of instant noodles. The contrast was jarring. The savior of Flight 808, the man who had commanded a machine worth millions, was sitting on a plastic stool, blowing on noodles for a toddler. Cashin stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room. His alpha pheromones, usually controlled, leaked out. Heavy cedarwood and expensive tobacco. Julian stiffened. He didn't turn around. I told the police everything. I don't want an interview. I'm not the police, Cashin said, stepping into the room. Julian turned slowly. He looked exhausted, defenseless without the cockpit around him. You. What do you want? Come to make fun of my dinner now? It's not caviar, but it feeds him. Cashin felt a sharp pang in his chest, shame. It was a sensation he rarely felt. He walked forward, stopping 3 feet away. He dropped to one knee. The room went silent. The other budget travelers stared. The billionaire CEO of Vane Industries was kneeling on a dirty linoleum floor in front of a man in a sweater. I owe you an apology, Cashin said, his voice rough. Julian blinked, taken aback. Stand up. You're ruining your pants. I don't care about the pants, Cashin said, looking up at him. I insulted you. I called you weak. I called your son baggage. And then you saved my life. You saved everyone. I did what I had to do, Julian said quietly, shifting Leo on his lap. It doesn't change who I am. I'm still the broke Omega you despise. No, Cashin said, intense and low. You are Julian Viper Harth. Discharged honorably. No, forcibly. 3 years ago after defying a direct order to bomb a civilian sector. You took the fall to save a village. Julian's face went pale. You investigated me. I had to know, Cashin admitted. I had to know who the hell makes me feel like a breathless cadet. Julian stood up, clutching Leo. Leave us alone, Mr. Vane. My life is complicated enough. I don't need a billionaire's pity or his curiosity. It's not pity. Cashin stood up, towering over him, but careful not to crowd him. It's an offer. I don't want your money. I'm not offering money. I'm offering a fleet, Cashin said. Vane Industries is launching a new aerospace division. Experimental aircraft. High-altitude rescue tech. I need a chief test pilot. I need the best. Julian laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. I have a child, Cashin. I can't die in a fireball testing your toys. I need stability. Then you'll have it. Cashin stepped closer, the magnetic pull between them undeniable now. Full benefits. A schedule you dictate. A nursery in the hangar. And me. Julian looked up, his breath hitching. You? I was a fool on that plane, Cashin murmured, reaching out but stopping inches from Julian's face, waiting for permission. I saw the world through a hierarchy that you shattered in seconds. You are the strongest thing I have ever seen, Julian. And I find myself desperate to be near that strength. Julian looked at the alpha's hand, then up at his eyes. He saw the regret, but more importantly, he saw the challenge. I'm not easy to work with, Julian warned, a small, dangerous smile touching his lips. I don't follow orders well. Cashin smirked, the arrogance returning, but tempered with heat. I wouldn't have it any other way. I don't want a subordinate, Julian. I want a partner. Julian hesitated, then bridged the gap, placing his hand in Cashin's. The electric shock was immediate, a promise of turbulence and passion that would rival any storm. If you ever talk down to my son again, Julian whispered, I'll drop you from 30,000 feet. Cashin leaned in, his lips brushing Julian's ear. I'll pack a parachute. And that is how the Viper tamed the wolf. If you enjoyed seeing Julian take control of the sky and the CEO, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive Cashin for how he treated Julian at the start, or should Julian have made him grovel harder? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then, prompt image. Prompt. Masterpiece, best quality, high-res. 1.2. Korean manhwa style, semi-realistic, digital art. 2 men. BL. Yaoi. Man 1. Julian. Omega, wearing headset, piloting plane. Intense focus, sweat on forehead, sharp eyes, gripping yoke, messy bun, wearing cheap sweater. Man 2. Cashin. Alpha, standing behind pilot seat, wearing expensive suit, holding a sleeping toddler gently, looking at Julian with awe and obsession. Background is airplane cockpit, storm clouds outside window, dramatic. Lighting from instrument panels, cinematic composition, intricate details, tension.